Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar focusing on mental health and mental performance support during the COVID pandemic. I'd like to first start by introducing the panel. First, my colleague, Dr. Kensa Gunter, who is a clinical psychologist and incoming AASP president. Also, Dr. Angus Mugford, who is an AASP past president and now the vice president of high performance for the Toronto Blue Jays. We also have Mark Aoyagi, who is a licensed psychologist and a past e-board member. And finally, we have Dr. Peter Haberl, who is the senior sports psychologist with the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, who has been contributing to AASP for many years at our annual conference. And myself, Natalie Durand-Bush, who is current AASP president, and I'm a professor and practitioner in the School of Human Kinetics at the University of Ottawa. I'll first allow my colleagues to briefly introduce themselves a little bit more to give you guys some background, and then we will get into some of the topics that we highlighted for the webinar. We'll have a lead for each topic and then have an organic conversation around it, and also leave some time for you at the end of the webinar to ask some of your questions. So I'll allow Dr. Kensa Gunter to first elaborate.
Thanks, Natalie, and thank you all to the attendees for joining us today. As you heard, my name is Kensa Gunter. I am a licensed psychologist and a certified mental performance consultant based out of Atlanta, Georgia. I have a private practice where I primarily see athletes competing at different levels, high school, college, and pro. And I also do some consulting work with organizations. And so some of the consulting gigs that I have, if you will, are with NFL teams and with those within the NBA family as well. And I also serve as an expert consultant, I guess is what they're calling it, with the NBA's Mind Health program, which is their mental health initiative that covers all leagues, including the NBA, WNBA, 2K, and our G League. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Angus?
Hi, so yeah, I'm Angus, and thank you for the invitation. This is an amazing panel, so I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone's experiences are. But my background really is as a mental performance coach, but I've grown into more of a systems role now. So I lead the performance services for our entire organization. We have 250 players in the Toronto Blue Jays org, and so I oversee all the sports medicine, the strength and conditioning, mental performance, and mental health. We have 6 mental performance coaches, and we have a mental health system that we integrate together. So really looking at things from a systematic approach in pro sport world.
Thank you. How about yourself, Mark?
Hi, I'd like to join everybody else in saying thanks for the invite to be part of this. Was really excited to see the lineup of panelists, and as a result, I probably won't have much to say because they're all esteemed colleagues. My background, I'm a licensed psychologist and certified mental performance consultant. I'm based out of Denver. I have a joint practice with my friends and colleagues, Artur Parchodowski, Jamie Shapiro, Jessica Bartley, and Mel Streno. And primarily my applied work right now is with the Denver Broncos and then with a corporate client. And also have an academic position at the University of Denver, where I'm happy to be co-director with my fellow director, Jamie Shapiro, as well. So that's the brief overview. I'll also vote for myself as most likely to be interrupted by my kids during this. So.
No problem. We totally understand. Peter.
Yeah, thank you for letting me join the panel as well. I'm honored to be here. For the last 22 years, I've worked with Olympic teams for the US OPC. And this has been quite jarring for myself because usually I spend my time in airports or overseas. And as I mentioned in the beginning, before we went live, I haven't seen an airport now in over 2 months, which has been really, really strange for me. But at the same time, it's been nice to be at home with my family as well.
Thanks, Peter. Myself, I'm a mental performance consultant like all of you, and I'm also the co-founder of the Canadian Sports Psychology Association and the Canadian Centre for Mental Health in Sport. I may be able to provide an international or Canadian perspective, as my other colleagues here are living in the United States at the moment. And just so you know as well, to our audience, feel free if you have any comments or questions. I know we will have some time at the end, but you can use the chat function and I will monitor that as we go. I'll monitor the time as well to make sure that we're progressing through our topics. And if you see me looking down, it's because I'm jotting some notes as we're having this conversation to be able to go back to some key points. So the first theme that we have pertains to the biggest challenges facing athletes from a mental health standpoint at the moment. And so I will ask Kensa to lead this discussion.
Sure. I mean, I think we've heard the word unprecedented repeatedly over the last several weeks, and I think it can't be understated how extraordinary and how novel this experience is for all of us. And so I think if we think about how it's affecting us mentally, anxiety is one of the first things that comes to mind. I think for many of us, just the anxiety that comes with navigating this ongoing uncertainty that's a part of this situation and the ever-changing reality. I think, you know, us as people, we like to have some idea of what's coming next, and we like to have some idea of certainty, but that idea of not being able to know and not knowing how long the situation is going to last really, I think, is creating feelings of anxiety for most people. Whether you've ever experienced anxiety significantly or not, I think that all of us are in a state of anxiousness around what happens next, right? I think the other two things that stand out for me as it relates to our mental health is this loss of control. You know, if we think about ourselves, think about the performers that we work with, having a sense of control over what you're able to do in your day-to-day, having a sense of control in terms of being able to plan for what comes in the weeks and months that follow is really something that allows us to stay grounded, focused, and motivated. And without that ability to control or have any even knowledge of what's coming next, it really can feel pretty unsettling for folks. And I think the other thing that I've heard from the athletes that I work with that I don't know if I would have thought of initially when the pandemic began, but there have been questions around purpose. Like, what is my purpose during this time? What am I supposed to do, right? We have a lot of performers that we work with. Their identities are tied to what they do in their area of performance, their sport, their field of play. And in the absence of that, I think for many of them, it's caused them to think about their purpose, and with purpose, thinking about their identity, who they are outside of their sport, who they even want to be outside of their sport. Certainly people are spending more time with their family and reconnecting in that way. But I've had a lot of conversations with people around what's my purpose and how can I be effective or productive during this time when I'm unable to do that thing which I normally do all the time. And so I think those are the three that have come up for me most: the anxiety, the loss of control, and then the questions around purpose and how that connects with identity. I don't know if the rest of you have seen that in your work or if that resonates, but those are the things that I've seen most often.
Anybody else care to elaborate? Oh, Peter, can you unmute yourself?
On the Olympic level, somewhat similar, you know, the uncertainty causing a lot of anxiety and almost a sense of, for some athletes, of a bit of an existential crisis, because you have this sort of massive event you prepare for years and years, then it goes away. And then the question is, well, do I hang on for one more year, particularly for an athlete who's a bit older, or an athlete who was peaking right now and doesn't know whether he or she or the team can peak a year from now. Or then you have team sport athletes, you know, they've gone through a whole year now of trying to make a team, and now they're adding one more year of that stress to the mix. Is not an easy question to address sometimes for athletes. So this question of purpose is a big one. Along with that is they can get so focused on the goal that they kind of forget about how they want to be on the journey. So the values can recede in the background and the goal is too much in the forefront. And that can be very challenging for the Olympic athletes and the Paralympic athletes.
I was wondering, those of you working as clinical psychologists, did you see an increase in mental illness symptoms in those who either had a previous condition or were more predisposed to be experiencing high anxiety, for example? Is that something that you noticed in some of the clients you worked with?
I can chime in on that one a little bit. I think that my experience, granted, it's a small slice, but I think that the situation, the circumstances have served as a bit of an amplifier. And so for people, as you preface your question with, those that were perhaps predisposed or had a pre-existing, whatever it was, anxiety, depression, whatever, I think it has in many cases been amplified or magnified. That being said, I think the less commonly heard story is that for those that were happy and content and had purpose and meaning, as Kensa and Peter were alluding to, a lot of them feel pretty good. They're kind of enjoying extra time at home and the facility's closed. Oh darn, I can't have a coach yelling at me, it hasn't been all bad for everybody. So I think there's a magnification on both sides there.
Yeah, that's an important point. It seems like there's a lot of variety in terms of how people are experiencing this. And we can't use a one-size-for-all approach in helping them to navigate through this. Were you going to say something, Angus?
I'm nodding in massive agreement.
Okay.
The one thing that I would add there, Natalie, though, is I agree. I think that sometimes, as Mark said, we can overlook the athletes or the people who are adjusting relatively okay during this time. But your question was around those who have been predisposed to anxiety or mental health conditions prior to the onset of the pandemic. Certainly, I agree with Mark again that there's a magnifier, but I also think for those people who may not have experienced any conditions prior to the onset, they too may be experiencing some anxiety for the first time. And one of the things that I think is important is highlighting that the situation that we're in is abnormal. So if people are experiencing emotions or feelings that they've never felt before, they could be completely normal reactions to the abnormal situation that we're in. So being concerned about your safety and your health, experiencing anxiety because of the ongoing uncertainty, those are normal reactions. Certainly we want to offer coping strategies for people to deal with those, but I think definitely understanding that this situation is taxing for all of us in different ways. And so even if you were not experiencing symptoms before, you may be experiencing symptoms now.
Good point. I'm going to move on to our next theme, knowing that we can come back to this at any point in time. I'm seeing some of the questions popping into the chat, so I will keep reading and try to weave those in, and if not, we'll have a chance to address them at the end. So our second theme pertains to how sport organizations are adapting schedules and programming in light of the pandemic. And I will ask Angus to chime in on this.
Sure. Yeah, it's a lot I can say about this area. So for Major League Baseball, when things kicked off, we were looking at the NBA as the kind of the first cases, and the whole sports world was trying to figure out what was going to happen. How serious was this? And we were 10 days out from starting our season and right in the thick of spring training, which is a really intensive period of time for us. And with 250 players, it's not just the 25-man roster that we kind of see on TV. It really is a huge beast. And I think the first thing I think is important to acknowledge is just the amount of uncertainty and confusion, where everyone was kind of looking to leadership, looking for clarity, and I think that thankfully we had a lot of systems and things set up that helped set us up for success, with just totally adapting a schedule and creating a hierarchy of needs. So, from a clear health and safety standpoint, how do we get players home safely? where is their home even safe, and the people that they're around, and just all of the logistical things were mind-blowing. But over time, you know, with that first couple of weeks really focusing on health and people's situations, we even had example of we have 25 Venezuelans who weren't able to get back to Venezuela, that we've had to put into a local hotel, you know, that we've had for the last 10 weeks, you know, and the ebbs and flows of how do we manage, you know, the mental health, the well-being, and the physical health throughout that, the social distancing, some of the cultural factors that were really new and just challenging for us to adapt to. But now that, you know, we're also, while that's always a base, you know, also looking at development, like are there windows where we can actually start getting each affiliate staff to work through things that they would have been doing in the season to make sure that they're still developing. And then the last part, which is occupying most of my time right now, is as we're waiting for the MLB office and the Players Association to negotiate on you know, the salaries and so on, is like, as we look to hopefully start a season in July, all of the re-entry protocols and then the reacclimation. So in much the same way as that there are different buckets of stress, you know, some people are, you know, really struggling and a lot of stress factors in the continuum, where there are others who are thriving, you know, maybe at home and whatever that environment is. Same is true physically. You know, you have some people who are literally doing nothing or may have no resources and a lot of restriction. And then you have the other continuum of guys who are ready to play a game tomorrow. So we're trying to wrangle that and make sure that we have a really individualized approach for when guys do get ready, so that we allow them to come in safely, but sure that they're starting this. It's certainly not uncommon, something like the NFL, when they've had a lockout or a negotiation and players come in, that the number of injuries and issues spike because of a lack of readiness. So we're trying to address health, performance, and development, you know, systemically. And that's, at this point, we don't know that there will even be a minor league season at all. So, you know, how do we manage that? And then how do we also manage the stress of staff? We're seeing many teams furloughing staff right now too. So there's certainly a lot of layers to the impact that we're trying to plan for and adapt to. Sorry, it's a lot, but.
Well, there, like you said, there are a lot of layers to address, but it sounds like you guys have a good plan in place, especially to be able to address the individual needs. Did anybody else want to add to that, just based on the organizations that you're involved in?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. So the NBA is certainly putting safety is the primary factor that they're using in making any of their decisions, but they now have some of their facilities that are open. If the clubs are in markets where the local jurisdiction has relaxed some of the guidelines and the restrictions, then they can't open their facilities, but they're being very, very cautious in terms of the number of people that are allowed in the facility at one time, the utilization of masks when they're in the facility, the idea of minimizing the people that are even on the court at the same time. And so there really is this very intentional and deliberate effort around maintaining the safety, even while we still try to engage in some level of return to activity. I can't even say return to play, because organized and group activities are still not allowed. There are no team activities happening, but the thought is that if places are opening up, some of these training facilities may be some of the safest places for the athletes to go, as opposed to going to a public gym or something like that in order to work out or engage in any kind of activity. And so it really is a monumental effort on the part of the player health groups that are really trying to think through all of the nuances that are required to re-engage in activity and to start to gather even in small groups in a safe way. And so it's been interesting to watch, but it's a slow process. And like I said, safety is the overarching priority when it comes to any of these decisions that are being made. But but certainly there's movement starting to happen. And with the players, of course, they've been at home for a while. Many of them are just ready to play and get back on the court, but they too understand that safety is of the utmost concern. And so it's moving slowly, but steps are being taken to re-engage in activity.
One thing I might add, Natalie, real quick, that I think it's easy for us to focus on the risk factors too, but I think there's a couple things I'll throw out there. The one is just the creativity. Like, it's been really cool to see people thrive and with constraints, looking at what they can do, and just so seeing how some of our staff have adapted, and even the players stuck in our hotel, the way that they've been able to use video games or just fun social media things together has been really cool. And I think one of the reasons, just much like our panel here, the number of people in sports organizations or other organizations around the world who are looking at the development opportunities, it's not often that we all stop at the same time. So being able to have outreach, and have staff exchanging, sharing knowledge, and how they're navigating this space too, I think has been another net positive as well. So there, definitely silver linings.
I don't have near the level of involvement or insight that Angus has with regard to this, but it has been interesting. The NFL is a very conservative league, and one thing that I don't think we've touched on a whole lot here is there's an obvious economic impact with the pandemic, along with the health impact. And it's just been interesting to see a very conservative league, as Angus said, the creativity and the attempts to sort of mitigate the economic impacts as well has been an interesting kind of side story.
Thank you for that. I will move to the next one. And I think we've already started to discuss this, is the importance of mental performance and mental health during the pandemic. I think this one is a no-brainer, but I'll ask Kensa to lead, and you guys can jump in at any point in time.
Yeah, I think we all know that this is not a situation that we can just physically power through, right? As we've already stated, this situation has taxed us in a number of different ways. And in thinking about how we continue to navigate the challenge and try to identify the opportunities, that's going to require us to kind of mentally be in positive and healthy places, and to use some of those mental skills, to think about how we can speak positively to ourselves, speak positively to others, how we can engage in setting some routines and some goals to help regain some of that control in our daily life, right? And it may not look like it looked before, but certainly focusing on the things that remain unchanged and focusing on the things that we still do have control over, those silver lining moments, as we talked about kind of prior to jumping on the call. I think our mood, our emotional state really does affect our perspective and our ability to see the opportunity that still lives in this challenge. I do want to acknowledge one comment, though, that I saw in the chat box, and I think it's a really important point to bring up as it relates to mental health and mental performance, is that there's been a tremendous amount of loss as a result of the pandemic as well. And certainly there's been loss of life. If we look at those numbers that continue to rise, those numbers represent lives, and those lives represent families that have been forever altered because of this pandemic. But there have also been other losses in the way of the loss of different events, different milestone events, the cancellation of birthday celebrations and weddings, and people having children and delivering children and having to do so alone because of the restrictions. And also in the world of sport, we think about the postponement of the Olympics. Seniors who weren't able to have their final season, those milestone events that really are significant moments in a person's life that we've had to kind of do without, and we just haven't had those. So I think from a mental health perspective, dealing with the grief and loss is also something that we've had to navigate during this time. And it's very interesting because we've had to navigate the grief and the loss kind of while being physically distant. And what we know is in our country and for many of our communities, gathering collectively is one of the ways that we help to process loss, and we provide support to one another. But we've had to do that, still processing those losses in the absence of those opportunities to gather. And so, to Angus's point about creativity, you know, being able to connect with people virtually, still being able to have some kind of ritual to honor either the life that was lost or the opportunity that has to be postponed. I think those are some of the things that we've seen people do as well. But it's a challenging task to navigate the loss and to even comprehend the loss that has happened with this situation as well. And so I think for that reason, again, attending to our mental health, really, really important.
Yes, I think you bring up a really important point, is that many people are affected by loss. And I know here in Canada, we haven't been able to have funerals for those who have lost their lives. So what we've been doing is having a virtual, you know, online funeral, at least to have some sense of closure, knowing that there's going to be something happening physically later. But that's really important. Anybody else would like to add about some of the mental performance skills, perhaps, that you have been focusing on with athletes, coaches, staff during this time?
So I can add some thoughts maybe on the Olympic level. One thing that I always try to stress with the Olympic athletes is that they're actually very good with uncertainty. And just to reinforce that they have skills to deal with uncertainty, as well as with the uncomfortable emotions that come with that. So I often pose this equation to them that if the uncertainty is high and the personal meaning is high, guess what emotions will show up? And the answer is uncomfortable emotions will show up, right? And to a certain extent, that's the life of an Olympic athlete who's trying to qualify for the games and then perhaps medal at the games. So what I'm trying to say here is it's normal to experience unpleasant emotions, and these athletes actually have skills to effectively work with them, right? And one of the key skills for them is to be really good at being present, just to be right here, right now, and focus what's right in front of you, and not get sucked too much into the future. So as much as possible, I try to, remind them and then reinforce that they have these skills and they can apply these skills in this, as Kensa called it, unprecedented times, quite effectively.
Yes, that's certainly an advantage that competitive athletes have had, is this ability to deal with adversity and this resilience. So I know from our perspective, it's something that we've discussed with them, that's a strength that they already have. So to rely on that and to see this as an opportunity to further develop this and then be able to use this post-pandemic to further adapt with the new normal, right? The new reality. All right, thanks for this. I will ask Peter to elaborate on some success examples or stories of coaches supporting athletes during this pandemic.
All right, well, Kensa mentioned the importance of routines and rituals. And someone who works with team sports, some of the things I've seen coaches do that's been very effective actually is to keep some of these rituals going, even though they're virtual, even though they might be over Zoom and so forth. And I've actually asked, the athletes, hey, what do you miss most? And what they miss most is, for the team sport side, is just to connect and to be together. And I've seen some coaches be very successful in providing that connection remotely. One of the sports I work with, the coach organized a Zoom session and then surprised the team by inviting all the alumni from the program that have been to the games the last 12 years. So it just became this really sort of wonderful connection to the past that then sort of also, I think, reinforced their vision for the future.
Any other panelists would like to share some of the great things that coaches have been doing to support their athletes?
I think just maintaining contact has been one of the biggest things that I've seen on my side, and just having group sessions, but also having that individual contact and just reaching out, not even from a sport related standpoint, but just to check in on them. I think sometimes we can easily lose sight of the fact that these incredible athletes and performers that we work with are people. And so I think just connecting with them on a human level at this point in time, you know, in the world of basketball, many of you may know there's a little show that has been airing for the past several weeks called The Last Dance. And so just connecting with people to have conversations about that, right? That brings it into the real time of what's happening, but also creates a point of connection. And again, looks at an opportunity, because I've had a lot of coaches to use that particular series as a way to talk through team dynamics and leadership and coaching culture and just all of those kinds of things. So I think I've seen that just the continued contact in group formats, the continued contact individually, and trying to use things that are happening now to help promote team culture and development, even during the midst of this time when we're separated, have been the things that I've seen that have been helpful and well received by the athletes.
I've heard examples of coaches, especially early on when the pandemic was declared, is just to give athletes permission to just be with their families. You know, they've been wanting to stay busy and stay engaged, but I've seen coaches just say, it's okay to not do anything, and to just take this time, take this opportunity to connect with your loved ones, to recover. For some was really important to take care of injuries, for example. So yeah, there seems some coaches have been offering this balanced schedule where there's some organized activities happening, but also some free time.
One thing I might just add to the mix too, and it's especially exaggerated in baseball, where, you know, they play 162 games in 180 days, they're on the road, away from families, but it's actually the coaches' support and the coach team. We have nine coaches plus, you know, another 10 support staff who are all isolated too. So one of the cool things they've been doing is just Zoom meetings, where they'll have a meeting, but then they have happy hour, which actually is turned into like 3 hours afterwards. But I think, and that, you know, engaging them, if you'd have said they would do something like that before the season, they would have thought you're crazy. So the fact that they've embraced that and even brought some comedy to it, you know, sharing, you know, silly videos or searching for, you know, bloopers of those coaches in the past, and just laughing authentically and being together, was a realization for me at how they, you know, they miss each other, you know, and they're in the locker room and a really tight bond every day, and now they're in this situation. So being creative about how they're utilizing that for each other, I think has been a really, really interesting twist.
Thank you for that. I will now ask Mark to share an example of a success story of an athlete staying motivated and resilient through this, because we know that for some, motivation has been an issue because their whole schedule and training modalities were changed.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. And I'll contextualize it a little bit by saying that the pandemic primarily hit during the off season of the NFL, and then there was the draft, and then now it's just sort of starting up with formal training. Well, you have to be careful the language you use during the off season in the NFL, but it's organized team activities is the approved term. Certainly not practice, but at any rate, with that piece of contextual information, and another piece that's relevant to the story I'm going to share is that I hadn't previously done much distance consulting. You know, a little bit here and there when perhaps an athlete was traveling either domestically or internationally or something like that, but never any sort of protracted ongoing consultation. So what the very first Zoom session I had was with an athlete that I'd been working with pretty regularly over the course of about a year. So, you know, number of formal meetings as well as even more informal chats, you know, around practice and things like that. And, you know, being careful not to disclose too much, but the one theme that came out over this year was that he kept reiterating a sense of shame over some events that had happened in his past. And I could never, he alluded to what the events were, and I could never really feel what the source of the shame was. You know, he would use that word and I could feel the authenticity of the emotion behind it. But when I'd sort of try and understand what led to that feeling, it was kind of I just never felt like I was on the same page with him. And then in our very first Zoom session, as we were sort of covering some of that material that we had been over before, he basically disclosed that I think the words that he used were, I had the issue that no male ever wants to have. And I'll leave it to your imaginations to figure out what that might have been. And so in the moment, you know, we processed it and we talked about it and we, you know, did all the sort of normal therapeutic moves there. But it was in retrospect after the end of the session that I was like, wow, I wonder if it was because of Zoom that he finally, you know, felt able to share that piece of information that was obviously very vulnerable and very sensitive for him. And I've had a few other moments in the, you know, days and weeks and months since then where I felt like actually the Zoom modality provided some, I don't know, breakthrough may be too strong of a word, but it certainly changed the tenor of the session. And in many cases, I feel like perhaps in a good way. In some other cases, I think it's led to kind of going the other way of maybe being a little bit more superficial and not having that in-person connection. So that's kind of the story I wanted to share. And then on the point of being motivated and resilient, like I said, and I want to be very clear, I'm not downplaying the severity of what we're all going through. But the experience that I've had, and again, we're talking about primarily a privileged group of people, perhaps not historically, but in their current circumstances, or at least have financial means and so forth. And, you know, by and large, they're concerned about family members. They're concerned about people. You know, none of the people that I've worked with so far have disclosed losing anybody. But they're concerned on that regard. But I think the resilient piece is it's kind of like when I'll check in with them, they're kind of appreciative of checking in and, you know, they'll kind of talk about it. And then it's kind of like, what about me? And, you know, here's what I want to talk about. And so, I think as Peter and Kensa discussed earlier, while uncertainty is hard for us all, they are pretty accustomed to it. I think Peter said sometimes you have to remind them that the way that they've trained to handle uncertainty in the athletic arena will transfer to the, you know, the real world, so to speak, or the world outside of sport. And then kind of the final piece that I'll talk about is the idea of, again, particularly in the NFL, the component of mental strength is something that they usually possess to a pretty high degree. And one of the things I'll often talk about with them is going back to Jim Lair's work, the powerful engagement. He has these 4 markers of fitness, strength, flexibility, endurance, and resilience. And then 4 dimensions to which those markers are relevant, which would be physical or muscular, but also social, emotional, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And so I'll often use the physical analogy of when a muscle group is overly strong and you don't have flexibility to balance it out, what happens? You're susceptible to injury. And then apply that same logic on the mental side. When the sport that you're playing really demands this emphasis on mental strength, if you haven't developed the mental flexibility to go along with that, you're also susceptible to injury. And so that's where a lot of my work focus is trying to complement the mental strength that many of them have. It's not universal, but by and large, they've sort of been selected for that already. And then trying to complement that with developing more mental flexibility.
Thank you, Mark. I am going to now talk about or bring about a topic that's very hot, and we've already started to talk about it, is the return to group training. And I know that for many organizations, that's the gist of what they're doing right now, is trying to determine protocols to return to group training. So I will ask Mark or Angus to, Angus, if you can lead just that discussion around what are some of the issues, some challenges.
Sure. Well, I've been digesting a 67-page report that MLB just came out with protocols and providing them feedback, and going through a lot of our staff and the details, which are significant. But as far as some of the challenges, I think the base is safety and money. Like, I have been surprised at how significant, I'm probably going to be careful what I say here, but I think in terms of just the collective interest of the Players Association and the ownership groups of teams, there's this really weird spot where, you know, there aren't going to be fans attending games, you know, more than likely, and each team just in MLB are probably losing somewhere in the region of $100 million each. And so, you know, but it's also a player's window of opportunity to, you know, earn for their career potential. So, you know, yet we have this, you know, if all the players have paid, you know, what they're due, so to speak, you know, it probably means that other staff are let go. And so there's a really legitimate, you know, discussion and fear around that. What does that mean to lose your earning potential? So I think there's a health fear, but there's also, I think, a career and status concern that players have. But on perhaps a more superficial but probably more behavioral challenge, I think we envisage is what the environment looks like. Like, the 67 pages of protocols in small font are extensive. So for everyone wearing PPE, for the coming in and entrance and only small groups of, you know, 5, and not keeping a social distance from your teammates, not showering in your facility, no fans, like the degree of change from what's a very routine oriented sport, it's all going to be very new. And, you know, it's quite likely we won't be able to play in Toronto. Hopefully we'll be able to find a way, but, you know, for every team coming across, theoretically right now, they would have a 14-day quarantine. So, you know, I think there's a very high likelihood we will play in our spring training stadium here in Florida. And so again, the degree of change and will be huge. And I think the lack of autonomy is another big thing, and not, you know, and how we police some of those things is unclear too, but being told what you can and can't do, and the degree of restriction, you know, whether families will be there and how much time they'll actually have is unclear. So I think really, you know, we are very thoughtful about the role of our mental performance coaches and mental health providers to, you know, be available. But even, you know, talking with them, we understand that their way of working is going to be very different. You know, where they had the ability to really be integrated into the environment seamlessly was fantastic before. We've got to be creative. Where are those opportunities going to be? If they're in the clubhouse less, if we're restricting the number of bodies that can be in a room at any given time, you know, how is it to have a consultation, you know, wearing PPE? You know, and the difference to Mark's point about Zoom and, or, you know, what we encourage over FaceTime or other video versus, you know, being in, you know, present together. So there's a lot of challenges, I think. And you know, even just look at some of the questions on the chat too. I think even once this is over, things will be different, and it's hard to predict which of those things are going to be different. And hopefully we can try to take the best and move on with other things. But I think a lot of that uncertainty and how people manage change will be a large part of it. And some will be more flexible and adaptive than others. And then what kind of support and resource can we provide those who struggle more with that?
I just wanted to add a little bit to that, certainly to kind of echo what Angus said. There's going to be a lot of change, and it's going to be different. Group training and playing sport is going to look different on the other side of this curve, if you will, than it looked before. One of the questions in the chat was, why do people keep saying we're going back to normal? And I really think because we know what normal is. We know what normal was. That's familiar to us. And so I think there might be some hope that some of that normalcy exists on the other end of this. But I think the reality is that we all know it's going to be very different. And in the absence of knowing what different looks like, we sometimes default to thinking about what we know and what's familiar. But I know we're talking about pro sport, and I know all of us are representing pro sport, but I also wanted to speak about youth sport and adolescent sport in a way, because I think that return to group participation is even more challenging in some ways than the pro sport. Like whether or not colleges are going to even have their fall sports is a question. And so that group training might be delayed, that group participation and competition might be delayed. Thinking about youth sport programs and whether or not financially they can survive the pandemic to even be able to get up and running again on the other side of this. I think those things are really important factors for us to be aware of as well, because it impacts the youth's ability to participate in organized sport. And from a financial standpoint, not just thinking about whether or not the youth groups and organizations will be able to survive and offer sports, but a lot of sports right now, youth sports, are pay for play. And so those families who have been impacted financially in very significant ways may not be able to afford to send their children back to youth sport programs. And so I think, you know, at the professional level, it's a certain number of challenges that we're thinking about, but I also think that there's some very real challenges on the youth sport level and the collegiate level in high school that we also have to think about and may have to provide support around, because that's a large population of people who may be delayed in their return to competitive sport. And the other piece that I wanted to mention in terms of the return to group training or return to participation is we know from the information that's been shared that the virus has affected different cultural groups in different ways, right? And African Americans, Latino communities have been hit harder by the viral infection. So I think when we talk about returning to group training, I think, you know, for those athletes who may identify with some of those populations, Black or Latino, who've been hit hardest, they may be a bit more concerned about potentially becoming infected with the virus, simply because the numbers have shown that those groups have been infected at higher rates. And so I think that's something that could affect a person's thought process around how safe it is for them to re-engage in group activities. And then also we know that with Asian American communities, they experienced a lot of discrimination and hate and racially motivated hate towards the beginning of the pandemic. And so going back out and interacting in group spaces also could feel like a safety threat to them, maybe not from the viral infection, but from prejudice and discriminatory acts and hate-based acts towards them. So I think in addition to the safety and from a health standpoint and the finances that Angus mentioned, I think, you know, different individuals are having experiences and different communities are having unique experiences, even in the midst of this global situation, that may affect their feelings of safety or comfort or their mindset as they return to engaging in group activities, including sport. And so I think it's important for us to be aware of those unique differences as well. And I don't want to call them challenges, but just things that we need to be conscious of and aware of as we work to help all of our athletes and performers navigate to what return to sport and competition may look like.
Thank you, Kensa. I'm looking at the time. We have 9 minutes left. I know that we wanted to share some tips and resources for supporting not only athletes, but just the overall sport community. So that includes coaches and staff. I know there's some questions about that. I wonder if we can speak to that and tailor that to some of the specific questions that we received, some of which pertain to telehealth. Differences, you started to address cultural differences. Kensa, some were asking about gender differences, even possibly team versus individual sports. What are some of these tips and resources that we want to offer, not only to keep going through the existing pandemic, but post-pandemic? Some of the things that are also working well right now that we want to continue doing. Did you want to take a stab at it, Angus?
Honestly, I'd rather hear what our esteemed colleagues are going to say. I know Mark and Peter had some things up their sleeve.
Peter?
Sure. I think one thing I try to stress right now with my athletes and coaches, are some positive psychology practices like gratitude, kindness, is really appropriate right now for this moment, right? As well as certainly, this is probably bias of mine, but just doing a deep dive into mindfulness practice. And again, this idea of noticing, what is present, and then can I choose where I want to put my mind? And Mark talked earlier about being flexible psychologically, right? Can I use my values to guide my behavior? So this having a conversation about, what do you want to stand for in the face of this? I know it's a simple question to help you clarify your values, and then use those values to guide your actions. I think those are some of the tools that I've been suggesting to my athletes. But I have a funny story on the mindfulness piece, if I can share that real quick, because I have the luxury that one of the coaches said, hey, the team twice a week you'll meet with Peter for sports psych sessions, right? And so the aim was, all right, the purpose here is to connect and to train the mind. And so I started with train the mind, right? You start with some mindfulness, and in Zoom you can use breakout groups, right? This is a really cool feature. So I would start with the mindfulness practice in the breakout groups and practicing groups, and I would jump from room to room. So I go to the first room, they're not practicing, they're talking with each other. I jump to the second room, they're not practicing, they're talking to each other. I jump to the third room, they're practicing, right? Because they got the one sort of Michael Jordan type athlete who's always driving everybody, and they're going to practice. I jump to the fourth room, they're not practicing, they're talking. Okay, well, so much for the mindfulness, right? Clearly, what they want to do first is they want to connect, they got to chat. So I got to flip the order here. So now what we're doing is we're doing connection first, and then we train the mind. So just trying to respond, I guess, to the feedback you get, and be flexible yourself as a consultant.
Good adaptation there, Peter. I have a question. I know that in terms of the telehealth, would you say, what are some of the do's and don'ts, like things that are going well, but also things that you would caution when you're trying to address mental health and possibly mental illness through telehealth? Would someone like to comment on that?
Go ahead, Kensa.
I was just going to say it's challenging. Similar to Mark, the first time I really engaged in any kind of telehealth practice was due to this situation that we're in. And I do have clients who are now asking, well, when can we meet in person again? And that's another question for us to think about. In terms of the telehealth piece, though, I think it really is for licensed clinicians, like paying attention to your state guidelines, because I know that some of the laws have been relaxed as it relates to the pandemic situation, but as laws get put back in place and are reenacted, I think it's important for us to be mindful that we're engaging in ethical and competent practice, and that we are following the laws as it relates to telehealth practice in our state. I think for most of us, we've probably adjusted pretty quickly to shifting from in-person. And so I think in terms of technology and knowing, you know, you want to have a good network and camera and all of that, I think we know all of that piece. But I think as we think about transitioning back to in-person services, it is kind of assessing on an individual basis, like who's comfortable with that. There may be some people who are less comfortable now with meeting in person. And so I think there's going to be a level of flexibility required on our part to adjust to our clients in a way that is health promoting, right? We certainly don't want to enable fears and anxieties, but I do think we have to have a little bit of grace and compassion and realize, whether it's mental health or mental performance, that there's no one size fits all for any of this. And so one of the tips that I had in terms of thinking about how we're moving forward with athletes, coaches, whomever, is I think we're going to have to really allow room for the different reactions, experiences, and meet people where they are in a much more intentional way to help them in navigating whatever the new next looks like. I call it the new next and not the new normal, because I don't even know what normal is anymore. But whatever the new next is, I think we're going to have a lot of compassion and grace in that, and really meet people where they are and be flexible. And our approach is to offer support that really feels like and resonates as support for them.
Did you want to add something, Mark?
I'm conscious of the time, so if you want to go in another direction, we're good.
I'm just trying to see some of the questions. I think many were addressed. Some pertain to specific skills, like would you use goal setting during this time? What about coaches and staff's mental health? I know in Canada, we've had weekly, bi-weekly calls with our sport community. And one of the general comments is that for the most part, at least in high performance, is that athletes are doing fairly well, but it has been more so the coaches and the staff that have been feeling quite a bit of stress. And so I would say for sure we play a role in supporting coaches and staff in all of this as well. And I can only speak for the MPCs in Canada, but they have had ongoing conversations with them as well. I think we should continue to do that. And even as we wrap this up, all of the opportunities that we've had in our profession to interact and exchange and support each other, I think it's definitely something that we want to continue doing in Canada. I would suppose it's very similar in other countries. It's just forced us to come together and to discuss what's working well, what are some of the challenges, and to work together to form this community of practice where we're keeping the pulse on things and helping each other to best support the community, right? So for us, I would say, like just what we're doing now, I would encourage people to interact amongst each other, between practitioners, because this collaborative care is definitely, collaborative support, collaborative care is definitely an asset. Any other final comments, remarks from you before we finish this?
I do want to say one thing. I want to encourage all of those who are on the call and my fellow panelists as well. We are healthcare providers also. And so it's important for us to take care of ourselves during this too. While we're offering support and caring for others, which is just what we do, I want to encourage us all to utilize some of the tips, strategies, and techniques that we're suggesting for others, because we're navigating the situation as well. So just encourage everybody to also extend that compassion and care to themselves that they so readily extend to others on a regular basis.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap it up, 5 o'clock. So I want to thank you for donating your time today to have this fruitful discussion. And I want to thank the audience for participating and for your great comments and questions. And have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you guys. Bye.
All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.